conversation tonight in Ennismore. Tonight we've decided to change the format a little bit and literally to have a conversation. And it is the first of 3 conversations on Dominican spirituality. So this evening we will open this first of 3 conversations on the title, What is Dominican Spirituality? So the brethren of this community of Ennismore have decided to really lead a conversation as a community, as we live Dominican life here, to share it with our friends and to join in the conversation. Next week we will invite one of our sisters from Cabral, who will lead us, Sister Ronnie Rafferty, who has worked in Argentina and who will speak on Dominican mission. And finally, the third on the series will be with Father Michael Dunleavy, The Way of Beauty, a journey to God with the Dominican artist Fra Angelico. So this evening we will just look at the first question, if you like it. What is Dominican spirituality? And I suppose for us, for Dominicans, probably an obvious place to start is, who was this man, Dominic Guzman? Who was he? Who was this man that started this movement, and when did he live, and what were the influences that started what we call the Dominican way? Perhaps, Ben, would you like to say something?
Well, I suppose we're talking about the 13th century, that was the time of St. Dominic's, and that was a period of huge change in Europe. The barons and the great landowners were being put to one side in opposition to the cities, and the people, the merchants, and a whole new way of people living and thinking, living within cities, learning to work economics, shopping. These were that was the world at the time, city life, and not civic life, and the life of ordinary people, developing their talents, and in the process becoming quite wealthy. But they were like basically middle class people, and the barons and the people of kind of history, and living in castles. They were all kind of in some way pushed aside in the context of the New Europe. And like St. Dominic is of that background. His background wasn't kind of he's not of a man of great kind of the family. They were kind of great people. They were merchants on the road of one town in Spain to another, taking in the produce of the farmers at the time, and selling that produce, largely grain and wine, selling it to the cities and towns around. He was that sort of people, and living in a new time in which the people were, I forget the name now, but leagues, is that the league? Leagues. In other words, kind of guilds, yes, guilds. And like it's sort of working in taking control of life in themselves, and not the very important people. Now, Dominic was born into that life, and he was, and his ethos, his mind, his way of thinking, his approach was born into the middle class life, not the autocratic one, or not the great kind of people, great families, but competent people who lived with the people and worked their life. He was born into that. But within that, he had the ability to study, and he became a priest, became a canon in a particular religious way of living in the cathedrals, and was well up, and you know, that was his background. From an ordinary background, a part of the people, but learning and advancing themselves, and that's where it came from.
So what you described really was a time of great social change, yeah?
Yes.
And so in the middle of this change, this man and this movement was born.
Yes.
And we know from history that Francis of Assisi had a similar movement going on in Italy. So something cataclysmic was happening in society and in the church.
Yeah.
The move away from monasticism, people going to the church, now it was the church that I come to the people. The movement was towards the people. So in a way, the beginning of Dominican spirituality is similar to what was the call of the Second Vatican Council, that the person is the centre.
Yes, and tying in with what Ben was saying about the whole social structure, the changing social structures. In England, up to the 12th century, Parliament was what we call the House of Lords. But it became recognised that the cities, as they were developing as centres of economic power and therefore also of political power, could no longer be ignored. So there developed the House of Commons, which was originally representation for city dwellers. And I suppose Dominic, as Ben was saying, he was a cathedral canon. And his life would have, I don't know if there are any readers of Trollope here, are there? The Barchester Chronicles, you know. It's about 19th century Anglican cathedral town, and it kind of looks, it's stories about the lives of the bishop, the dean, the archdeacon, and the various canons. But his duties attached to the cathedral would have been to sing the office every day, to preach when it was his turn to preach, and to do any other pastoral work that happened to come his way. The cathedrals didn't have much of an outreach. Now, they were very real centres of prayer, but without much of an outreach. And then Dominic had this experience that brought him into a completely different world. His bishop was sent on a diplomatic journey to Denmark and wanted a companion on such a long trip, and asked the young Canon Dominic at this stage would have been about 30, wouldn't he? And so they set off to Denmark, and it was when passing through the Languedoc and Toulouse area that they saw that life for the Christians was not as settled as cathedral life in Oslo. And they came into contact with the Albigensians, and the whole process began actually on that journey. Dominic sat up all night long in conversation with an innkeeper who was a follower of the Albigensian version of Christianity, debating and listening. And actually Dominic never went back home. He saw that, as Stephen was saying, that like Vatican II encouraged us to face the real world as it is. When he encountered the world outside the beauty of the cathedral life. He felt the Spirit was calling him to engage. And he was about 10 years trying different kinds of engagements. And never, interestingly, I think he was one of these people who never regarded an experiment as a failure. He tried to go about preaching to and converting the Albigensians one way. It didn't work. And he didn't feel he had failed. He just had worked out that this method didn't work. So we have to try a different one. So those 10 years were a time of experiment, and in ways a time of darkness too, but a time of engaging with something that was real, and that he had been able to step out of the beauty, because cathedral life with a functioning chapter of canons is very beautiful, but he was able to step out of that and to face new questions. And we hope that that's part of what we actively inherit from him, that we treasure the beauty of liturgical life and at the same time are open to identifying new questions and to identifying the possibility that there may need to be new approaches to deal with them.
So in a sense what you're both saying is there was continuity and discontinuity.
Yes.
The Dominic and the movement initially was faithful to what they knew, to being a way of church life, a prayer in the church, but at the same time something new was happening. Yeah? So how has that been lived out in Dominican spirituality over the years, this move between continuity and discontinuity? How have we lived that out?
Maybe I think it's we should remember that at those times it was before printing, and it was also a situation in which the only people who were authorized to preach were the bishops, but they could delegate people to preach for them. But as a result, there was very little education of the ordinary faithful. They picked up the basics from their family, I suppose, but there was a lot of ignorance in that. So we're wide open for a movement like the Albigensians, or there was another movement which the Franciscans kind of echoed in a way against the riches and the wealth of the church, And so in a certain sense, the Franciscans were moulded by that kind of thing, and we were moulded by the need for preaching, the need to go out there to the people and bring them the basic gospel. Sometimes people say that our vocation is theological preaching, but that's nonsense, we have to know theology before we can preach with any kind of ease and that. But at the same time, what we preach is for the ordinary person to try and make the faith available to them, And for example, one of the examples was when St. Dominic was trying to do something with the Albigensians. There was a group of Cistercians were told were trying to do the same, but they had all the trappings of the monasteries and their riches and so on. They were getting absolutely nowhere. So that's why Dominic had a tremendous, and in a way, echoing the Franciscans in a way, that he had a tremendous draw for poverty, simplicity of life, And I remember seeing a description of the early Dominicans, and people thought they were like a group of begging bones, and were going around in white woolen habits, heavy woolen habits, and they said they were more often mended than washed, And so, for example, when St. Thomas, an early Dominican, who was of a noble family, he wanted to join the Dominicans, but the family was absolutely horrified. What do you want to go away with that crowd of bones for, but fortunately, Dominic or Thomas had the sense to kind of follow his vocation, and he had been a great enrichment for the order as a result too, you know.
Yeah, the point you make there, Archie, is concerning the Albigensians. It's good for us to know that there was a mass movement of people who followed them in their thousands, you know, because what they were offering was a life of simplicity, poverty, close to the gospel as some saw it, in that sense. Whereas the distant monasteries and church and certain opulence of lands and so forth, was sort of scandal to people. So as Archie referred to, when the Cistercians tried to preach the gospel, the problem was they were not credible because they weren't living like the people, whereas Dominican Francis and that whole Dominican movement took on, if you like, the life and the manner and the language of the people. Hence, in a sense, the innovation of it.
Part of the thing too about the Cistercian preaching enterprise concerning the Albigensians, they had been delegated by the Pope to do it, so they were officially papal legates. So like a Lord Lieutenant in an English county representing the Queen has a uniform and has a big official car with the Queen's flag on it and that, they were papal legates. So they were coming in with all this officialdom attached to them, you know. And of course, people on the ground didn't find that sympathetic.
I'm conscious that in the conversation tonight we only have an hour to do this, so we can't cover everything. But I'd like to develop the point that the three brothers made, is that from the very start, if you like, adaptation seemed to be a Dominican mark, and openness. So when we look at the history of the order, we see that throughout the history of the order. I'm thinking of Albert the Great, I'm thinking of Martin de Porres, I'm thinking of people like Montesinos and Las Casas. So economically and politically, the order seemed to be able to speak to different situations. Would that be a fair description of the as a component part of Dominican spirituality, the ability to adapt the gospel to particular situations?
And to be able to read situations and to see what is valuable in what is new, not to be automatically pushing it away.
And as well as that, built into that was the system of organisation. Like, it wasn't hierarchical from the top. Like, from the very beginning, it was democratic. And the leaders were elected by those who were following in the order. And everything was an extraordinary concept, taken perhaps from the universities and from the guilds, that leadership emerges from the people rather than coming from the hierarchy down. And that's why, like, in the 700 to 800 years of the order, like, all our leaders, really, priors and provincials and the rest of it, are all elected from the very beginning. So therefore, like, the basic ethos, I suppose, of the order is like what's going on in the mind of the ordinary people. It is not kind of as if there's a special unit in the middle with kind of all sorts of backgrounds and kind of calling the shots. Ultimately, what emerges, the life of the order, is the life of ordinary people thinking, relating to one another, and working with one another. Okay?
There was an aspect of our democracy too, that they were elected for a time. They weren't elected for life. Abbots in the old monastic system were put in for life, you know. But we are put in for 3 years or 9 years or something like that. And there's a saying, you know, be careful on the way up because you're going to meet them all on the way down. You know?
And everyone comes down.
Maybe at this point to throw open to our guests, if we have enough for this section on Dominic and the beginning of the order. Any comments, any reactions for yourselves?
Well, it's nice to hear that the order is run, you know, and I'm taken by the fact that it's that they're elected, you know what I mean, and only for a time, you know, it makes perfect sense. And I guess that's the seed of democracy that we have today in Ireland and in lots of countries. And while it has its cumbersome features, it is far better than what you get in other countries that we could start talking about that are doing the devil now with another country. You know, so it's nice to hear that, like about civilization and democracy. A lot of it actually came with religion at times. You know what I mean? You know, and so it's nice to hear the Dominican version of that.
Yeah, I appreciate the historical background as well. And period I didn't really know much about at all. And the idea of it being, a time of change, as if there was some kind of structural change or development taking place with regard to the way people organise themselves in the beginning of. It sounds like maybe not the beginning of cities, but of trading, trade and commerce. So that's interesting as well. And then.
And talking about our spirituality, you know, it's basically a basic Christian spirituality, you know, and it's with the emphasis on the humanity of Christ, you know, and that's we don't know exactly what relationship to the Rosary St. Dominic had, you know, there are all kinds of traditions that. But I mean, if you look at the Rosary, it goes from the infancy of Christ right through his life, you know, right to the resurrection and so on. So it's all, the whole emphasis is on the human Christ who kind of was with us in all things and so on, and eventually he was glorified at the end, we know that, you know, but he went through everything that we could possibly go through in a human way, you know, and they say without sin, but what that means, I don't know either, you know.
Well, actually, you're preempting the second part of our conversation because moving on, I suppose, from the beginnings, one of the hallmarks of Dominican spirituality has been what's now called Christian humanism. I mean, John Paul spoke a lot about it, Benedict spoke about it. Would you like to comment on that? And what is Christian humanism? And is it a hallmark of Dominican spirituality?
Sorry, could I just say something? It just occurred to me, Father. I think hospitality is one of the first things I noticed when I started coming here. And they say that's the hallmark of a Christian, isn't it? Hospitality. And it certainly has always been in this house, and I've been coming a very number of years now. So beautiful.
Thank you. So, what is this thing, Christian humanism?
It's such a
in plain language. Archie referred to it, and we touched on it a bit there.
Yeah.
So let's make it, without getting too erudite on it.
It's hard to define these things. And there was, within the tradition, there is a suspicion of systems of thinking, and that if you do this is the best way to do it. If you do that, it's the best way to do it. And there will be kind of speeches made and books written on this particular way of doing things. Whereas as I understand it, the Dominican way of life, as I experience it, is being an ordinary person and who is conscious of their ignorance. We have a phrase of St. Thomas Aquinas, who is regarded as perhaps the greatest theologian that ever emerged in Western Christianity. But he said, and he has all these books, but he said on several occasions, the ultimate insight into God is to know that we don't know him, you know? So that in actual fact, kind of all theology is helping us to learn less what we know, but what we don't know in dealing with God. And in that process, in the living one's own life and living with the basics of the Bible, the New Testament, these are the fruits of insight into the spirituality of the order. Remember humanism. God became a human, okay, in the person of Jesus. Jesus lived his divine nature as a human being, as reaching to people. I noticed, and I'm fascinated about two features of the way Jesus worked his ministry. One of them is, it was always personal, I, thou, you know. If you look at the miracles of Jesus, he how so regularly and habitually, when a person was sick and coming to him for help, Jesus reached out to that person, touched them, you know, raised them by their hands. Like a humanism and a humanistic way of dealing things and dealing with a person as a person was fundamental to the type of preaching and ministry that Jesus did. Because like our greatness as a person is the greatness of the basic way of living as designed by the gospel, which is loving God and loving one another, or being friendly with God and being friendly with one another. And the basics is that really. And just being a good human being and enjoying that and loving that. And loving nature, like again, like one of the mysteries of the spirituality of Jesus was his tendency regularly to pull away from crowds, to go out into the countryside, to pray with the birds. I would say that birds, praying in the middle of the life of nature, leaving the village or the town very early in the morning and going out into the countryside and experiencing the wonder of the world and in some way being shaped by it. That's all part of the building, I think, of humanism. You know, sort of just being with the world, being with nature, being with perfection, and sort of being aware of your basic ignorance most of the time. And and sort of
So,
taking that away.
so as you describe it, with for general comment, as you describe it for Ben, that this gathering is for a conversation. So the way you're describing Christian humanism, the American spirituality, that it's a way of dialogue with others.
Yes.
It's not separate from. That's for a comment to me.
It is, and you'll find that, I mean, Ben was speaking, I was just thinking about Thomas Aquinas and his great his great central work, the Summa Theologia, which is in 3 parts. The second part, which is the biggest one, is so big that it is broken into 2. But the first part, which is about God and about Christ, and the second, or the third, which is about the sacraments. But this middle portion, by far the biggest portion of it, is about the virtues, about what it is to be a human being. And I think that shows a mindset, that and it isn't analysing sins, it isn't, it's analysing virtues. What are the qualities that make people good? Now, in looking at those, it also looks at what detracts from it, but the whole drive of it is what will make people good. And so that's part of the Dominican inheritance that we treasure, that our view of dealing with ourselves as human beings and with all the people for whom we may have to accept pastoral responsibility. The whole purpose is to learn how to be fully rounded, enriched spiritually and every other human beings. People who engage properly with one another. So I think that's an aid.
That would fit in, wouldn't it, with the way St. Thomas kind of took his morality from a pagan philosopher.
That's right.
Aristotle,
Yes.
And he Christianized it, of course. But basically, it was kind of how to be a good human being,
Yeah.
But he obviously, as a Christian, realised we can't achieve that thing
Yes.
by ourselves, so he had to bring in the grace and faith and Holy Spirit thing, But it's interesting the way he does it, He at the end of his treatment of each of the virtues, he goes through the gift of the Holy Spirit that kind of accords with it, and that kind of thing, so that the virtue, even though it is, as you say, a way of becoming rounded and fully human, we're not doing it by ourselves, but then an extreme of that thing would be to say, that our human nature is so corrupt that it has nothing to offer, which I don't think we've ever accepted that notion, even though it's there very often in the tradition of the fathers, that we are so corrupt, But he didn't go at that angle, He realised that we can be very corrupt, But not that we start off with the thing that, we're so hopeless, corrupt and all that only God can lift us up by.
And
How did he make us corrupt?
He didn't, we did.
I don't believe it.
But again, part of what Archie mentioned there is Aquinas being willing to structure his thinking around Aristotle, whose works had been kind of forgotten about, and they came into Europe through Spain, through Averroes, through Muslim scholars. And the idea of a Christian scholar engaging with the thinking of Aristotle was abhorrent to an awful lot of people at that time, particularly people in church leadership. First of all, because Aristotle was a pagan, and secondly, because the route through which we knew his work was Muslim. Thomas didn't worry about that. If this man had something true to say to us, we listened.
The word pagan, I don't know, somewhere back in my lifetime, isn't the word pagan originally from the idea of people from over the hill?
Well, country people. Country people.
Country.
Yeah, country people.
Yeah. So,
Peasants.
hasn't it got the wrong connotations? I mean, you think that people don't believe in anything. That's,
Well, words shift their
Yeah.
meanings.
And maybe just to rebut this kind of section, sorry, please.
I don't hear very well, so I may miss a lot. But what I got was that the discussion seemed to be about the idea of how transforming a human, a soul, whatever the proper term is, to a good person. That was the word I heard. It's teaching somebody how to be a good person. Well, and that to me, that seems like that's a huge concept. How deep do you want to go with that? You know, and is that about, you know, instruction or having rules to follow, or some other kind of transformation?
What you find in, I shouldn't jump in because Archie is the moral theologian. But no, what you find in Aquinas, and we're talking about the Dominican way, what you find there is that it's about building up virtue, building up habits of good behaviour, of helpful behaviour. And it's the building up of habitual ways of conducting yourself that is important, much more than keeping rules.
Right.
Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. He took the idea of
Yes.
habits
Yeah.
from Aristotle, but he turned them into virtues.
Yes,
Yes.
but an awful lot of damage has been done in families because of the rules.
Oh, yes.
I know because I experienced in my own family. I've got 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls, adults now. But I found they're not interested in church anymore, and yet they were all educated in Catholic schools. And as a mother, I find I suffered a lot worrying about those kind of things. And I'd love to let go because it's painful, really, because I know they're very good people, and I know that they go out every morning, they teach their own children, be kind to someone today. And yet it's the rules that have caused their own, myself, pain, worrying about them. They go to church, they believe this rule, and they don't believe in any of it.
Isn't what you have seen them do a beautiful Christian humanist thing there, that with their children they are day by day building them up
Absolutely.
in habitual virtue.
But I'm worried at the end of the day that they will think it's themselves and not God. I mean, God seems alien to them at this stage, and Brian Cox and the stars seem more evident to them. But it really is painful. I know I've suffered as a mother worrying about it.
I suppose one great thing is there's no one way about it. I mean, the fact that your children are struck with the beauty of nature and creation and are passing it on to your grandchildren. I mean, that in itself, there's something transferring, Archie's talking about there, about the goodness and the beauty of creation, the world. And just back to the question you asked, it struck me that a parallel would be, I think, at the moment, when Bernard was talking about forming good habit. Like at the moment, I think of the School of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, or therapists, psychologists, encourage people to form good ways of behaving, living, make good choices that will lead to freedom and happiness. Okay? So in a sense, as far as I understand it, what Aquinas was talking in Aristotle about good habits, good virtues, in secular language, we might be able to understand it by looking a bit at what this particular school of psychology teaches today. Her choices, or good choices, lead to happiness and freedom. And we are free to choose these things, as opposed to other schools of psychology which are more deterministic. Maybe Freudian or something. But that school, CBT, is saying, no, the choices you make, you're responsible for, lead ultimately to your freedom. A point I'd come back to is that moving on from Dominican theory days, it seems as if the order has continued that dialogue with science and humanity and psychology. Very briefly, we have time for it, but we can look at people like another Dominican called Albert the Great, who was a theologian, botanist, science, theology. We look at the Dominicans in the so-called New World who defended the indigenous peoples, who took on Christopher Columbus and took on the Spanish might at the time, and even church authorities. Martin de Porres, so unfortunately is depicted as a simple little doormat, and was quite the opposite, quite a man of great, not beyond charity, yes, but also great justice. And we look at, down the years, the order has, in a sense, got its hands dirty in getting involved in projects along with others. So that, in a sense, that tradition of dialogue and conversation, working with so-called believers and non-believers, and that openness, in a sense, has been also a characteristic, as I understand it, as I have seen it, of our Dominican way. And it is something that certainly the Pope Francis currently is talking about non-stop, if you like, you know, this need to engage, this need to smell the sheep, this, you know, this constant reference to engage. So from what Ben said earlier and Bernard about Dominic being part of a movement that was a time of change and turmoil and the Spirit of God moving him into that time, along with Francis and others, that it's fair to say we continue that today. That this house continues it. We'll come to Dominicans Ireland in a second, but in a sense, without jumping the gun, that's what this house is about. This is not a parish church. This is not a church where services are held. It's a church of engagement. It's a church of, as the member said, a community of hospitality, a welcome for all, and now everybody is welcoming. So in a sense, we are continuing that here. Yeah? Any comments on that? Either from yourselves who come here or from brethren?
I was just thinking we have this supplement to the Dominican breviary, you know, and there's the saints and the blessings of the order, and a lot of them are around the same time as St. Dominic or very shortly afterwards. So you'd be inclined to put it down to all that just first forward, like, you know, it all died. But I'm always delighted to find someone, say, from the 15th or 16th century and then 17th or 18th century close, and there are some of them that bring them near much closer to our own time.
Yeah.
You know, there was one man, I can't remember his name now, but he was a hero against Nazism and all that, you know, and he was a Dominican tertiary there, you know. So I mean, in that sense,
Yeah.
the tradition you're talking about has been carried on by very virtuous, holy people, you know, but they weren't just pious Joes that were involved in.
Sorry, Charles, for one point, I'll be killed. When we're talking about Dominican men and women.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about Dominican men. She's
And there, and of course that brings us to Catherine.
yes. So Catholic, for example, Catholic. Have you heard briefly say something about her or somebody else? Catherine.
I thought she was an extraordinary woman.
When was she alive? When was her? When
She
lived?
would be in the 14th century, and that was a time in which a decent girl either got married or became a nun. But Catherine didn't want either option. She didn't want to become a nun, and she didn't want to get married. And she saw probably the challenges of marriage when she was one of about 20 children in one family. Okay, and well, we'll leave that. But she was an extraordinary woman. Like, people kind of cared about her. And there was one, I forget the names now of the people, but there was one gentleman who decided that he had heard all this business about Catherine of Siena, and he decided he'd go and see her. And he anticipated he'd meet a person who would be kind of laying down the law and kind of serious. And he, to his astonishment, and he was changed forever, he met this young lady who was full of life, of good humour, of friendship, of love, and was able to talk to people and talk to people as one equal to another, okay? Whether there were difference in sex or whatever. So she was that person. She got involved, like she risked her lives in working in the hospitals, in the cities during the times of plague, and she went there and did her bit. She was involved in, and now we're talking about a 20-year-old woman, okay, in a world that was still dominated by men. She went to the, she had something profound to say, but I've forgotten it, okay? And, but she worked with, in the fighting between individual groups in the cities and with other cities. She worked very hard to bring peace to them. She travelled from Siena in Italy to Avignon, where the Pope was, to persuade him to come back to Rome. You see, so she was very...
And it worked.
And it worked. It worked for a while.
She went and told the Pope what to do, and he did it.
She's a very direct woman. Reading somewhere that she wrote in something, a letter she wrote to one of the popes that she managed to, she said, "For Jesus' sake, Holy Father, would you learn to control your temper?"
And you know, like, back to the thing, she was what we call a late Dominican. She was associated with Dominicans. And thankfully, she got great support from them, okay? And that enabled her to keep going. And there was a Raymond, Raymond Penford, who became master of the order at one stage. But in her younger days, he knew her, and he sort of listened to her and supported her. And he did in latter days that she was lecturing him, and he'd fall asleep, listen to it all, and sort of, she'd give him a poke, poke him up. But like it is, yes, there's so many good things to say about her. She died young, and
32.
32. But like was very much lived among the people and was totally without fear in whom she was talking to. Okay?
And she was the archetypal baby of a big family, you know, absolute confidence
Yes.
because of having been absolutely doted on.
And she had, and Raymond kind of picked a feature of her spirituality that intrigued him, and she lectured him on it, okay? And he kind of dozed his way through it, but as the years passed, he learned to live that way himself. And it is this to sort of, it was something like sort of what Stephen was talking there about ways of, anyway, the, that like to sort of go back, go into yourself, okay? And just kind of, you know, instead of running here, there, and talking too much, except just be quiet in the presence of God, and just being with them in the quietness, you you know, and that can be done like in the sort of in your bed, like a sort of walking, traveling, a sense of God and Jesus being with her, and just resting with God. And that was the sense of resting with God in the tumult of life, the black deaths and all sorts of things. There was a lot to be worried about. Okay, but she was able to develop a core of peace within herself, not just being with herself, being peace with God. And that seems to have been like a basic feature of her spirituality, which is not a system, not wonder. You know,
She spoke about residing in the cell of your heart. And then was saying, so for her, the phrase that one didn't need a place or a structure or even an organization, dare I say it, but to reside in the cell of the heart. And that cell could be anywhere. And as we said, she has made patrons of Europe, doctor of the church, and I'm conscious I'm here in Cork, or in Ireland, and St. Dominic died in 1221. And I may surprise you to know, very shortly afterwards, the Dominicans arrived in Oxford, in England, and then into Ireland. So maybe would one of the brothers like to say something about the history of the Irish Dominicans, very briefly, when we arrived here, how long we're here, and so forth.
Well, they arrived they were in Ireland with sort of very, very quickly.
24.
Within weeks, within
years,
just
months,
a few years of the death of John.
Yes.
Okay? And they arrived, they moved in, initially, they moved into the cities, you know, and the language would have been English and Latin and so on. And gradually moved out of that, you know, and into the people and into the Irish speakers. And you look around the country and the number, well, the same with Franciscans now, you know, perhaps even more so. And they were kind of Dominican priories and things like that, springing up all over the country. But initially, settling themselves in the cities, you know, which were Drogheda and Dublin and Cork and places like that.
Kilkenny and Waterford before Cork, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting.
We're about to celebrate our 800th anniversary of the brothers arriving in Ireland.
2 years.
24.
Yeah,
24.
Yeah.
2 Italians, that's right.
Kind of following the Norman influence in one way, but then the Normans were justifying themselves that the Irish Church needed reform, and then some of the Irish chiefs, particularly the O'Connors, welcomed the friars into towns in their territories to preempt the Normans coming in, you know. My hometown of Roscommon being one of those in 1256, and there are ruins there, and that priory was, its official title was the Royal Priory of St. Mary, because it had been founded by the O'Connors.
Just here in Cork, we still were told that we came here around 1226, I think, in Cork. The original foundation was where St. Mary's of the Isle is now, and there's a wall in the garden there, which the sisters tell us, Sister Mercy, that dates back to. So where Griffith Hall is now, the student residence of Cork, it's a parking centre now, apartments. That was the site of the Dominican Foundation, and I remember some years ago when the archaeologists were working, you could see the foundation of the building, and if you go there now, there's a montage on the wall of the car park showing the priory as it was, but in its heyday and how it fell into ruin. From there, the move, I believe, was up to the north side, over to the Shandon area. And in a sense, we've stayed in that area, so today we have the Priory of St. Mary's, Popesky, and
the official title still
St. Mary's
is
of the
St.
Eye.
Mary's of the Eye.
Yes, after the
There was a time in the beginning, of course, when they were forbidden to take native recruits
yes.
from the Irish, you know. But that passed off fairly quickly, probably because of O'Connor and his kind of initiative kind of taken in, kind of allowing it available. But I remember going to a lecture one time about Dominican and Franciscan foundations. And apparently at one stage they had a situation where there was two gates to many towns, you know, the North Gate and the South Gate, you know. And the Franciscans had control of one gate and the Dominicans had control of the other gate. And of course they could charge soldi for coming in and going out, like, you know, which was part of their able to kind of survive and that, you know.
Yes.
But it just shows how they kind of integrated themselves into the whole city kind of thing, you know. They didn't become Cistercians with huge monasteries in the country, or, you know.
Like, when did Meister Eckhart first onto the scene? And did he have an effect on Dominican spirituality? Was it kind of an aberration? If I understand it correctly, I mean, his was a much more direct line to plug into God or whatever universal power is out there. But
My sense is he would be, Meister Eckhart,
That might be.
that he would be faithful to what we were talking about earlier, this Christian humanism.
sorry.
He was faithful to the early Dominican, what we call Christian humanism, this approach of dialogue and conversation. Eckhart was. So he wasn't. Today, perhaps people are using him as somebody who was almost marginalized from the church or marginalized from the order, but he wasn't. So he would be, for his thinking, would be very, very close apart to what is authentic in both the Christian spirituality and, of course, in Dominican spirituality.
And he, Eckhart, he condemned systems of religious type, you know. Sort of there were people coming on and said, this is the way to do it, or that's the way to do it, and so on. But Eckhart's attitude really was, like, it's the basic stuff that's there in the New Testament and the Bible, and you live according to that.
And also his insistence on the point that Archie made earlier of, you know, not claiming to know God, not claiming to own God. You know. There's a constant thing in his thinking, but to some people, I think some people today misquote him and use him as a stick with which to beat the church. But in actual fact, he's allowed for the person of Christ and for good theology and good thinking. Would actually place him right at the center of the order, at the center of the church. But nowadays he has been, if I dare say, misused or abused almost for reasons. But certainly for myself, one of his constant, some of his sermons, which I admire very much, he speaks about this level of indifference, the idea of not knowing. And he was part of a movement at the time. The technical term is apophatic theology, complete theology. So there was a movement in the Rhineland area, what we call the Rhineland mystics, and they would have that common thought of a certain freedom around God, and that wasn't innovative. You find it in the Psalms. You are a hidden God, you're a God. We cannot possess God. So there's great freedom in Eckhart's thinking, and certainly today, for those who understand him, he is widely thought of. But I suppose the health warning is that I've also read books where he has been misunderstood for personal reasons. People appropriated him for for their own reasons, and it's more about them than about Eckhart.
And you see people taking any theologian who says, as he and Aquinas, you've got to be careful about what you say, about thinking that what you say is everything about God.
Yes.
And that's far stronger in Orthodox theology than it is in the Western. The apophatic thing of holding back from saying we know everything about God.
The church did give that impression.
Oh yes, but that isn't the real tradition.
Yes.
The real tradition is, as Archie quoted Thomas Aquinas, whenever I say something, whenever I say God is such and such, I must immediately say God is not, is also not what I have just said.
And
They
then,
call it an analogy.
But then the Catechism says, how do we live? The purpose of our existence is to get to know, to love, and to serve God.
Yes.
So how do you get, I suppose, how do you get to know Him in that sense?
But you get to,
Other than
but getting
Spirit.
to know God is getting to enter into a mystery. It's not knowing your 9 times tables.
you see, this is why I have terrible problems with this mystery, because what kind of a God comes to people in a mysterious way? I mean,
Well,
it doesn't make sense. How are we to get to know Him?
well, he did become a human being
He did,
in
yeah.
Christ. You
Yeah.
know?
Yes.
And in that sense, you could say Christ is the translation of God into human
Yes,
terms.
yeah.
So we can,
But I think
we
it's
can see
probably
a
not
lot,
God in my
a lot about
It's
what
confusing.
God is like by looking at what Jesus was like and so on, you know. But then, of course, as Bernard says, you have to say, but he's a lot more, or that's not the whole story, you know, because but after all, you just kind of have to realise that we talk about him being infinite, you know. We've only got little minds that can take a certain amount, you know. And for example, I came across there lately that they've discovered now that about the universe, they know less than about 10% of what's out there, you know. And so, if that's kind of an image of God, well, if we knew 10% about God, we'd be doing well, like, you know.
I'm sorry, can I just tell you this? I had the privilege of going to Mass at Avignon on holiday one time, and the priest there at communion, when I went to Mass, he said, "Regard du Christ." Now, I don't know much French, but I did know what he meant.
Yes.
Look to your Christ.
Yes.
Now, I think that's far more meaningful than what we say at Mass.
But even to come back to your word, Emmanuel, mystery, we're a mystery to, we're a mystery to ourselves. I'm a mystery to
But
myself.
actually being revealed to us as we're supposed to become other Christs.
Yes, yes. But just sorry to go back to the word mystery, what God is mystery. But in a sense, we're a mystery to ourselves. We don't know the depths within us. There are further depths. And so, in a way, it's not so alien for us to stretch that to God, accepting the mystery I am to myself, or you are to me, or I am to you, and apply that in a sense to, as Arthur said, somebody
To the
who's arguments here. Maybe just before moving to the third section of the chat tonight, any response to comments from our guests?
Just one thing, see, you were talking about our female branch.
Yes,
You know, maybe people don't know that there are 2 branches.
yes, yes.
There's the enclosed Dominican sisters. They go back to St. Dominic's own time, you know. In fact, the first thing he founded, before they founded the order, was the convent of nuns, you know, and these kind of enclosed nuns are descended from them. Whereas there are kind of Dominican sisters you find more or less all over the place in schools, and that they come from another branch of the order. I mean, there was somewhere along the line they invented a kind of a lay branch of the order, you know. But then, you know, people could kind of join that, and they would take vows and all that. So that kind of morphed into the kind of sisters we have now that have taken religious vows, but they're active in and they're marvelous. They're marvelous, mighty women we've had in the teachings in Ireland and all over the world, you know. So that's part of our treasury.
Just one an example of how mighty the foundresses of these Muckus Park Convent in Dublin, the Irish Dominican sisters, founded by they were founded at a time when what was about to become UCD, the Royal University of Dublin, was not taking women. So, but they worked out by some legal that it could confer degrees on women. So Muckus Park was giving university teaching to women before UCD was and before Trinity was. Like they were terrifically far-seeing and creative, and they didn't allow barriers to stand in their way. That they found a legal way of doing it, a cunning way. Yeah.
Just to say the work continues, you might say, well, the sisters are aging in the schools, but I work with the Dominican Sisters Cabaret Justice Project, so just let you know, currently in Ireland they're running a project for women in direct provision and women who leave direct provision, and also women who would now try to begin a life on their own. All these women are asylum seekers. So one project we have is the Young Mothers Network, which is funded by and supported singularly and solely by the sisters. There are no brothers involved, no Dominican friars involved. Totally the sisters do that. Yeah? And also their work in Lumen in Dublin as education centre as well. They're a pioneer that work for the deaf in Ireland and pioneering schools for learning disabilities. And also, as Verna was saying, in the mainstream education, they added a different dimension, in particular to empowering women. When women were not being empowered by the state or by the church. Yeah? They did it. And I was struck recently in a documentary on Marion Finucane, and someone asked her where did she get her political acumen and her ability to think critically, and she said, I went to the Dominican Sisters. At the time, some of the sisters were returning from South Africa during the apartheid years. And she remembered one particular occasion where a sister came into the class and said to the girls, learn to question everything and everybody. And she said that the prioress walked into the classroom and even the prioress questioned her. Principal, which said okay. Yeah. So any before we look at the last section of this evening, any comments from our guests?
I've had a long kind of coming and going with the Dominicans over, I suppose, from late teenagers right up to here I am now. And I have always experienced that sense of that sense of ongoing, almost an adventure in faith, rather than something that was static. I always felt the Dominicans were reaching out, and it's just nice to hear the history of kind of going out into the cities and being on the ground basically. And as you say, to moving into education as well. So, as I said, I would have always felt that the Dominicans had that sense of, if something didn't work, let's try something else, but keep people in the knowledge of the faith and of Jesus and God and the Word.
I can remember from experience, I was in southern Africa, and I was doing work with the Catholic sisters for about 3 months. And I remember going to one of their schools in a place called Pretoria, and they had a school there, kind of Paulus Klooster. But I was intrigued. This was apartheid had to go on for another 5 or 6 years before anything happened. I can remember watching the kids coming into school, and the kids were like, there was a sprinkling, or a significant sprinkling of coloured children. This was, and they were being taught there, and it was kind of in total defiance of the apartheid regulation. And it was like, they're pretty old now, but I can remember them talking about the times in which they were arrested and in jail. Okay, for short periods now. But like they decided at a certain stage to sort of open their schools to everybody, not just the white people, or not just like the education system was different for the black, we could say the black people, than for the white people. The black people were to be educated, to be workers, and so on. The white people being educated to go into the universities and the rest of it. Whereas they decided that no, there's going to be one way, one system for them all. And in actual fact, the apartheid, forgetting the name of the words now, but the apartheid politicians who were for it were against all this. But in actual fact, the white people in the Department of Education, supported the Dominican sisters, okay? And it was a marvellous thing, and they suffered a lot. But kind of they made a one big impact.
Because they were talking about, I suppose we see a lot of, on the media lately, of I suppose, bashing on kind of religious education and so on. But what, in fact, many people forget is all that good work that was done, not just in, say, South Africa and other parts of Africa, but just here at home in Ireland. I mean, an awful lot of people that are very outspoken and very church bashing were educated by the religion. They, in fact, they're a success in a way that they have become thinking individuals. And you hate to see that the good and the work that went into the education system through the religious over the years, both say, priests, brothers and nuns, that all they can remember is bad stuff rather than all the powerful stuff that has made Ireland what it is today, because we had such an input of great thinking people, and there was obviously a few bad eggs, but most of the time there was great work done, and we're the product of that.
Just speaking about the Dominicans in Ireland, it's worth acknowledging, kind of time this evening, the work of people like Father Paddy McGrath and the work of Fergal O'Connor, one working with single mothers, co-founding Ally, Dula Fallon, Father Fergal, and the other setting up a centre for Irish men who are HIV positive coming back from England. So that story will be told someday, but it's worth acknowledging now in public here. Just to drawing this to a close this evening, sometimes time is flying by for us, thankfully, is that the question of, at the moment the church is moving towards what's called synodality, it's moving a distinct dialogue and conversation. So I suppose it comes, we're back in a way full circle. Dominic's time, as Ben and the other brothers described, was a time of change, and the early friars moving into change. Now we have a time of change, a time of turbulence, and certainly as we speak tonight, political and economic change in Europe and beyond. But in the church and in the whole system of belief and faith. So what is the contribution of Dominican spirituality to this particular situation we now find ourselves in? Where do you think, or what do you see, or what is in our history that can in a way speak to that situation? And the floor is open.
I would say just a small contribution here is that I think what I see in Dominicans is a community. We have the diocese and we have the priests of the diocese, but they're not a community in the sense of the Dominican community. And I think it's lovely to see a Dominican community and a community of men, and there's a community of women also, as you were pointing out, two branches of that. But I think it's nice to see the community and that people live together trying to find the mystery of God, and the mystery of themselves to a certain degree, and the mystery that's in all of us, and trying to find our own salvation in ourselves, and those issues that we all have, you know, those of us who are not just into definite things in life, you know, because like life is made up of many, many aspects, and there's the mystery things and all that at the end of the day will be, what's our purpose here? Like, why am I here? Like, why am I this and why am I that? All those kind of why questions, you know. So that's what I like about it.
I would ask a question on that. It is, because it's still not clear to me what Dominican spirituality is. But is Dominican spirituality something that can be lived by lay people out in the world? Or is it more confined to a religious order, or, you know, some...
Well, we have a lay structure, you know, we have these Dominican laity, you know.
Pardon?
Or we have Dominican laity, you know, and they're men and women. They're not nuns, they're not priests, they're not brothers. They're just lay people who kind of take, not vows, but they make a promise at some stage, you know, and associate their religious life.
So, but
with
it's an
Dominican.
extension of... I mean, you know, apart from that, is it something?
I suppose, it's not as kind of tangible a thing as, say, Benedictine spirituality or Jesuit. The Benedictine, there's a rule which people can read and can see that parts of it can be lived in family life, you know. And similarly with Jesuit spirituality, there are processes that anybody can follow. Dominican spirituality isn't contained in a book in the same way, but elements of it are certainly livable. Like Archie mentioned with the lay Dominicans, a commitment to daily prayer of the office, a commitment to study of the Word of God, and to, you know, exercising our minds to understand as best we can what's happening in the world, and a commitment to sharing truth in whatever way we can. Like those shapings of life are possible for anybody, anywhere, at any time. And those are some of the things that make up the Dominican spirituality. Some of our leaders have wanted and have been saying, and that I understand but don't fully understand what they're saying, that our spirituality is our electoral system. Which, you see, it's not just that priors and masters and that are elected, but that actually the policy-making body is not the executives, but a chapter, a kind of parliament that meets at local level every 4 years and at international level every 3 years. And constitutions for the order at large can be changed only by 3 chapters in sequence. So there's that. There has to be a lot of listening and conversation for the order to function. And I think that's what they mean by saying that our electoral system is our spirituality. So that in that sense, prayer, study, sharing and outreach of some kind, they are possible for everybody.
But I think what would really frustrate people is, does anybody after years and years of study see the end result or see a hope for what it's all about?
No, because the whole purpose of study is to keep on entering into the questions.
Will they ever get there? That's the problem. You know, it's...
Let me know when you do.
Yes.
I try. But I think Jesus should become more alive within each one of us.
Yes.
And And I think that should be spoken more often about, rather than all the rules and the don't do's and the do's don't. You know, I think, I get frustrated because I think over 2,000 years, are we going to be content to just plod on forever? There has to be more. There has to be more. Understanding of what it's about.
But if it's first name.
Me, Annette.
And I said earlier, I said that she could answer the question and in a way refer to your question as well. In talking about a hallmark of Dominican way has been to try something new. To try. And Ben said in the beginning tonight that Dominic try this way, then that way, that way. So in a way, a hallmark of our way is that I was trying to meet the order 15 years ago. I was one of those diocesan priests, by the way, before I became a Dominican. Is the breadth of the order, the breadth, and there is a particular Dominican way there that you don't see it in other groups. This breadth and this willingness to try something new, and because of the structure, the governance of the order, it allows us to do that. We're not top down. We're not top down. If I were a Jesuit, I would be assigned to a house. I have no say. I think by and large where I'm going. Ours is quite different. Yeah? It has its weakness, but by and large I think it's more humane. Yeah? So I certainly think this idea, the reality, and I was thinking earlier, it's too late to talk about it now, but a man that Ben often speaks about, Pierre Clavelet, one of our brothers in working in North Africa among the Muslim community, his way of friendship rather than proselytizing, you know. So there is constantly this adapting and breadth and openness within the order. And I see it certainly in my own interest. I work in justice projects. I see it in the order trying new things at the moment. I see it in Spain, in Italy, what we said earlier about Father McGrath and Father O'Connor, new things. You know, single mothers, men who are HIV positive, let's address that. Our Carver sisters dealing with education, dealing with the deaf, dealing with areas that no one would touch. So it's constantly this kind of almost breaking new ground, going to places where others don't always go, has been part of our way.
You know, I often talk about, I used to talk about to students and people about kind of like the Bible studies has been part of my life to a certain extent. But like I always tell people that my experience of studying the Bible was just an endless journey of discovery. And always, it's always new. And you pick it up from somebody else and an insight and things like that. And says, gosh, that's great. You know, and it's a voyage of discovery. And thanks be to God. The time that I might feel I've done enough or had enough, what a bore it would all become.
At the risk of being purely commercial, but Dominican publications have published a very good life of Pierre Clavelet, which is available from our website.
So to thank you for coming this evening, and tonight we in a way was an experiment.
Just to say something, so as we wind up, you know, I just want to say that I really enjoyed the evening, and I'm amazed at the richness, you know, of the history and also the richness of the Dominican life. You know, I really found listening to the three of you in the community in putting forward, as you were speaking, the enthusiasm that you had as well. It was really, really felt something, you know, really deep. You know,
Thank you.
Well said, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll continue next week the second conversation on Dominicans in mission, and in particular with Sister Ronnie Rafferty, who is a Dominican Carver sister who spent most of her life in Argentina, and in the latter years of her time in Argentina working with women's groups. So Ronnie will lead us to a conversation about the Dominican mission in Argentina. And the third will be Father Michael Dunleavy, who the work of Angelico, the Dominican artist. So we thank you and look forward to meeting you next Monday night at 7:30. So safe home. Thank you. Thank you to Chris Coffey.